When we were small children, one of the ways we used to amuse ourselves and build up our mental skills at the same time was putting together puzzles. They were simple, colorful pictures, painted on thick wood and cut into a few funny-shaped pieces that fit snugly into a frame. I remember one of my favorites was a covered wagon, the kind used in the Old West. Another was a cowboy, while still another was a big-eyed puppy dog. When all together in the frame, the pieces were not pieces at all, but components in a whole picture that made sense. As soon as we dumped the pieces onto the floor, however, they became just a confusion of jagged bits of colored wood, and no one could have told what they represented. Hundreds of times we would take them apart, and hundreds of times we would put them back together again, until we knew the parts by heart and could bring the picture back to life quite easily. And then all was right with the world again. The wagon could roll again on its journey west. The puppy had a tail to wag again, and the cowboy would continue throwing his lasso where he left off. Eventually, those simple wooden pictures became too easy for us and were no longer interesting because no longer a challenge. We graduated to big people puzzles, the jigsaw puzzles of 100 or 300 or 1,000 pieces. These were large, complicated affairs, made not of thick wood, but of cardboard. They had no frames, no hints where the pieces were to be laid. The little pieces were dumped out onto the dining room table, where they would remain, sometimes for weeks, until piece by piece, in a team effort, the picture was assembled. Every time someone passed to the dining room, the temptation, the challenge to contribute to the picture would be too much. Some minutes would be spent in intense concentration, and 2 or 3 more pieces would be added to the growing masterpiece. Some of these were hard. Whether it was a forest scene or a water scene, a starry night scene or a sunset scene, it was difficult to distinguish one piece from another, difficult to figure out what was destined to go where. The colors, the shapes were simply too intricate, too different, or too much alike. I remember one particularly impossible puzzle was a close-up picture of a magnificent fireworks display. Try putting that back together. When trying to determine how the pieces fit into each other, there were 2 things to look for: the continuity of color and the shape of the pieces. When the patterns of colors became either too different or too much alike, the shape of the pieces was the key. If they had 2 straight edges, they were a corner for sure. That was a good start. The ones with 1 straight edge were placed together, and the outside frame could be formed. Then all those confusing pieces in the middle had to be carefully studied to see which arms and legs and heads fit into which sockets, and the real challenge began. But slowly, gradually, a beautiful picture began to take shape, and the excitement grew. At last, there was only 1 piece left, and then, of course, there was no longer any question as to where it belonged. The artists had completed their work, and the masterpiece could be admired, until it was carefully taken apart again, and the pieces shaken up to wait for the next generation of geniuses to take up the challenge. So often as we go through life, everything around us seems an impossible puzzle. At first, everything is new and confusing and magical somehow, and all its brilliant chaos. With the eyes of a child, we look at the colorful pieces all around us, which make no sense yet, but are wonderful in their fascinating newness. The chaos is enough. We admire it in its mystery. Later, we begin to see patterns and wonder whether somehow at least some of these things fit together. We are so proud of ourselves when we fit the first pieces together and find that what we had seen as a useless part of a wheel is actually a vital part of a moving wagon. And suddenly we long to find the whole wagon, for it just might take us somewhere. Piece after puzzling piece begins to come together for us, and a picture takes shape. Our first picture of the world. But then the fascination grows, and we find new and more complicated puzzles coming our way. We are puzzled by our own emotions, by the people around us, by the challenges each day brings. Questions haunt us. What is life? Who is God? Who am I? Who are you, and who are you to me? The puzzles become larger, the pieces more intricate, the confusion more intense. And we know somehow instinctively that somewhere in all this mess of joys and sorrows, chaos and uncertainty, hopes and disappointments and dreams and desires, there is a bigger picture. And we hear people calling that picture life. We can't see the picture. We see only the meaningless pieces. But we are irresistibly drawn to finding that picture, to making sense of it all. We can't help thinking that somehow everything really is interconnected. The universe is not as absurd as it sometimes seems. There is a meaning somewhere, hiding in the jumble of seemingly disconnected pieces. We try to piece together a frame, and suddenly we discover a true corner, a foundation onto which everything seems to be built. More often, though, we find that nothing seems to fit. And more often still, we don't seem to fit in either. The colors are wrong, the shapes wrong, and everywhere we look, we discover pieces missing. We become frustrated, discouraged, overwhelmed. Do you ever feel that way? But then we catch a glimpse of a tiny fragment of the picture, an aspect of the truth, and we are inspired to continue our puzzle solving, determined to see the forest, the ocean, the fireworks, desperately searching for meaning and completion, and gradually grasping the gratifying reality that nothing makes sense apart from the whole. We watch the disparate pieces of life drifting together, magically finding each other again, fitting perfectly into each other's arms, like the reunited pieces of a jigsaw puzzle, perfectly cut and perfectly assembled. And we begin to see that in truth there never were any pieces. Only our distorted vision has sliced life up into disjointed, separate realities impossible to comprehend, impossible to live. In truth, it is all one, has always been one, will always be one. Finally, we place our hand on that final piece, and like an explosion into reality, the magnificence, the beauty of the whole is revealed to us in one eternal moment. It is then that we suddenly realize what we are seeing, whose presence we are beholding and have been beholding all along. It is then that we rediscover a long-forgotten, deeper truth with which we were born. It is then that we regain the wide-open, marveling eyes of a child, forget the irrelevant, illusionary puzzles that have distracted and complicated us so unnecessarily in adulthood, and bow down in simple worship and wonder before the awesome, undivided, uncomplicated mystery of God.